The man known to history as Stonewall Jackson was born as Thomas Jonathan Jackson on the 21st of January 1824. It is widely understood that he was born in the town of Clarksburg in the state of Virginia, although another theory suggests his mother gave birth to him while visiting family in Western Virginia. Stonewall was a nickname he would acquire very late in his life. His father was Jonathan Jackson, a Virginia attorney. He traced his ancestry in America back 3/4 of a century. The Jacksons had become a prominent family in the north of Ireland in the county of Londonderry in the 1660s, with an estate near the town of Coleraine, though they were of English descent. One scion of the family, John Jackson, Thomas's great-grandfather, was convicted of a crime in London back in the middle of the 18th century and was sent to the United States to perform penal labor at a time when the southern colonies were major sites for the sort of penal transport which Australia would become infamous for in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was an inauspicious beginning, but the Jacksons prospered in the United States in the decades that followed. Thomas's mother was Julia Jackson, née Neal. Thomas was her and Jonathan's third child, having previously had a daughter named Elizabeth and a son named Warren. Jackson was born during one of the most critical periods in American history, one in which the country was expanding in ways which would soon have implications for his entire life and that of many other Americans. When the United States was born in the late 1770s and early 1780s, the country consisted of just 13 states, lying in a north-south axis along the east coast, the former 13 colonies founded by the British. Even as the Founding Fathers were putting ink to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the country was already expanding westwards beyond the Appalachian Mountains into regions where Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia now lie. Settlements were also being rapidly established on the southern shores of the Great Lakes. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 would bring a vast tract of land into American possession from Louisiana north to the Dakotas. By the time Jackson was born in 1824, the Union had expanded to 24 states with the admission of Missouri in 1821. This had created two issues that would soon impact on Jackson's life. Firstly, it brought the expanding United States westwards into what is now Texas to develop a border with the similarly new state of Mexico. Secondly, it created an issue concerning the status of slavery in the states which were being newly admitted to the Union, with northern free states arguing that newly admitted states should be free states from the very beginning, and many in the southern slave-owning states holding that places like Louisiana were primarily being settled by people from Georgia, the Carolinas, and other southern states, and so should have the same slave-owning status and laws. The man who would one day become known as Stonewall had a very difficult childhood. In the mid-1820s, typhoid fever was prevalent in Virginia. It claimed Thomas's older sister, Elizabeth, in early March 1826, not long after his second birthday. Then, just over a year later, in late March 1827, Jackson's father died from the same disease. To compound the difficulties for Thomas's mother, she was heavily pregnant at the time of Jonathan Jackson's death, and she went into labor just hours after her husband's passing, giving birth shortly after to another daughter, Laura Ann. The Jacksons had been far from wealthy, and Julia Jackson was left with considerable debts when her husband died. She supported herself and her 3 young children in the years that followed by working as a seamstress and by teaching her sewing skills to other young women. Ultimately, she remarried in 1830. Thomas's new stepfather was Blake Woodson, an army captain who married Julia Jackson seemingly despite her children. His subsequent actions certainly do not indicate that he warmed to his new stepchildren, for when Julia died in 1831, just a year after marrying him, he disappeared entirely from their lives. The orphaned children had already been sent to live with their grandmother on their mother's side in Lewis County, who still presided over a household of Julia's large brood of brothers and sisters, many of whom had remained unmarried. As such, while they had lost their parents at a young age, the Jackson children were raised in a loving family household here in the 1830s. Warren Jackson was gone early to begin attending military school. Thomas thereafter developed a very close bond with his younger sister, Laura Ann. His character developed early as a shy but resourceful figure, one who developed a sense of self-reliance based on his early experiences. Thomas spent much of his childhood and teenage years at Jackson's Mill, a functioning grist or grain mill run by one of his uncles in Virginia. While Laura Ann would return periodically to their grandmother's house, Thomas developed a particular affinity for working at the mill. Although he received virtually no formal education, he taught himself to read here, with some aid from a slave on his uncle's estate. By the time he was a teenager, he was sufficiently well educated to pass on some of his skills in a makeshift local school. This was the resourceful and clearly intelligent, though formally uneducated young man that headed for West Point Military Academy in New York State in 1842 when he was 18 years of age. West Point had been founded as a national military academy in the nascent United States in 1802 and has remained the premier military school there ever since. At first, Thomas struggled here. His lack of formal schooling made his studies difficult, but through intense application, and also owing to his natural ability to retain information as soon as it was relayed to him, he managed to gradually work his way up the class from being one of the weaker students in 1842 towards the top quarter. He was one of a class of 59 cadets who graduated in 1846. He finished 17th amongst these, not a premier performance, but very respectable for an individual who had come from such a difficult background and had such a limited education before coming to West Point. When he graduated in 1846, he did so with several individuals who would become notable generals in the American Civil War, including George E. Pickett and George B. McClellan. Even as Jackson was completing his studies at West Point, tensions were escalating along the southwestern border. The regions around Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona had been claimed by Spain as part of their vast colonial empire in the Americas back in the 16th century. However, beyond some exploratory missions to the region and the establishment of missionary settlements here to try and convert the natives to Christianity, there was little effective colonization of these areas by the Spanish for centuries thereafter. Owing to this, the border regions in Texas, especially between the United States and the new state of Mexico, when it emerged independent of Spain in the early 1820s following a long war of independence, quickly became a point of contention between the Mexicans and the Americans. In 1836, an independent Republic of Texas, one which was more aligned with the U.S., broke away from Mexico. It would be engaged in disputes around the fixing of the border with Mexico, either at the Rio Grande or some other region, for years to come. The US then inherited that border dispute when, in February 1846, the Republic of Texas was formally annexed and entered the Union as the 28th state. War broke out between Mexico and America just 2 months later, when American troops entered Mexican territory around the Rio Grande and were attacked, leading Washington to declare war. The Mexican-American War was already underway in 1846 when Jackson graduated from West Point. He was quickly assigned to the 1st U.S. Artillery Division, which was set up to take part in General Winfield Scott's expedition to Mexico. Scott had been head of the United States Army since 1841 and would hold that position until early in the American Civil War 20 years later. His objective in 1846 was Mexico City, the aim being to capture the Mexican capital and quickly force significant land concessions out of the Mexicans. It would take until the autumn of 1847 before Scott's invasion force, Jackson included, made it to Mexico City. They commenced a siege on the 8th of September. 5 days later, Jackson distinguished himself in the capture of Chapultepec, a castle fortress on the edge of the city. The city itself capitulated 2 days later. Thereafter, the Mexicans entered into peace negotiations with the U.S., and through the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, signed on the 2nd of February 1848, it ceded a vast stretch of its northern territories to the U.S., comprising the subsequent states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, and parts of Oregon and Colorado. With this, the Americans in Mexico City and other regions of central Mexico, Jackson amongst them, began withdrawing back northwards to the U.S. 24-year-old Jackson was soon redeployed after serving his apprenticeship in Mexico. Back in the mid-19th century, Florida was still the one part of the eastern United States that was a relatively new part of the country, having only gradually been absorbed into the country after being a Spanish possession in the 1800s and 1810s. Even once it became part of the U.S., the government entered into a series of conflicts known as the Seminole Wars against the indigenous people there, who were able to resist American government for decades by launching guerrilla wars out of the swamps of the Florida Panhandle and the Everglades, often aided by escaped slaves from Georgia. Jackson was sent here in 1849 and was appointed to the second most senior position at Fort Meade, not far from Tampa. There, he soon developed a fractious relationship with the head of the garrison at Fort Meade, Major William French. Both men reported back to Washington on the alleged failures of the other on several occasions. Jackson was well aware that French, a figure nearly 10 years his senior and who had earned commendations for his service in Mexico, would ultimately win out in this disagreement, and in 1851 he decided to resign when it became clear that the War Department was not going to support him in his accusations against French. Jackson's retirement from the army in 1851 did not lead to his complete abandonment of military life. Instead, he acquired a position straight away as Professor of Natural and Experimental Philosophy at the Military Institute in Lexington, in Virginia. This is akin to a modern professor of physics, and Jackson was also specializing in artillery at Lexington. He knew the position was in the offing when he made his decision to retire from his post in Florida. He must have questioned the wisdom of his career change early on in Lexington, as he did not have any natural ability as a teacher and did not acclimatize well to it initially. Before long, some of the cadets had begun referring to him behind his back as Tom Fool. There was more than a touch of elitism inherent in this. Jackson was a rural Virginia man from a poor background, and his accent and pronunciation revealed this, particularly when he spoke in his high-pitched tone during military parades. He was often teaching young cadets who came from upper-class landed Virginia families who viewed him as their social inferior. Others, though, would later reflect that he was kind and attentive to the more dedicated students, and over time, his lack of natural abilities as a teacher were compensated for by his hard work and dedication. It was also at this time that Jackson became a husband twice and then a father. On the 4th of August 1853, he married Eleanor Junkin. She was the daughter of the Reverend George Junkin, the head of Washington College, a school in Lexington. This first union of Jackson's was brief, though, as Eleanor died just over a year later in October 1854. She had been pregnant and died from complications after having a stillbirth. 3 years later, in the summer of 1857, he then married Mary Anna Morrison, who went by Anna. Continuing his habit of marrying the daughters of preachers and the heads of schools, her father was Reverend Robert Morrison, president of Davidson College in the town of Charlotte in the state of North Carolina. They would have 2 children. Mary Graham was born in 1858, though sadly died in infancy. A second daughter, Julia Laura, arrived in November 1862. She would live into her adult years, being claimed by typhoid fever, the same illness that killed Thomas's sister and father when he was a child, in 1889, when she was in her mid-20s. Thomas's home life with Anna, brief as it might have proved to be, was one of the few areas of his life where he felt free to relax, and she would later describe her husband in affectionate terms, something which contrasted substantially with his reputation for being a strict and stern figure in public and as a commander. A further element of Thomas's character was his religious piety. After a youth in which he had been a casual worshipper, he had begun to embrace a more zealous Christianity in his adult years, particularly after he arrived in Lexington to begin teaching at the Military Institute. It was more than just a coincidence that he ended up marrying the daughters of 2 different ministers. Such were his growing associations with the Lexington Presbyterian Church in the town. In time, much of his life began to revolve around his faith, teaching at Sunday schools after church services. His religious views were matched in intensity by his hypochondria. He suffered from a number of physical ailments throughout his adult life, apparently having issues with both his digestion and his vision. It's not possible to determine where these legitimate conditions ended and his paranoia began, though many people during his lifetime commented on Jackson's peculiar habits and his belief that reading by lamplight would destroy his vision, or that he should refrain from eating certain foods or at certain times. These features of his personality and his guarded approach towards people that he did not know particularly well led many to perceive Jackson as being a somewhat peculiar character. Conversely, the impression left by those who got to know him and whom he relaxed around was of a largely ordinary man with the same level of quirks and unusual mannerisms that are revealed in anyone once one knows them for long enough. Jackson wasn't the only one who was anxious in the 1850s. The United States was becoming increasingly disunited by the middle of the 19th century. There had always been 2 Americas. As early as the 1780s, when the American Revolutionary War was coming to an end, some of the northern states were already considering prohibiting the institution of slavery. Their economies had never been reliant on slave labor, being largely trading and manufacturing centers where greater degrees of urbanization prevailed, whereas the South was rural and dominated by cotton and tobacco plantations, on which large numbers of slaves carried out most of the labor. Many northern states began to ban slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and became free states, while the southern states became more entrenched in their determination to maintain slavery. The issue became more and more fraught from the 1830s onwards, once Britain banned slavery entirely across its empire and other European and American nations began following their lead. By the 1850s, the US was a laggard in not having banned slavery nationally, and northern politicians were determined to correct this with new parties, such as the Free Soil Party, being established primarily with the goal of abolition in mind. Though eventually it was the Republican Party, founded in 1854, which would drive the abolition movement prior to the American Civil War. These developments would shape the rest of Jackson's relatively short life. Of course, the question arises, what were Jackson's own views on slavery? They were complicated. On the one hand, he was a slave owner himself. At one point in the 1850s, he owned 6 slaves. Some of these he had acquired as part of the dowry for his second marriage. Others had requested that he purchase them at public auction, believing that Jackson would make a more decent owner than they might otherwise expect if they were sold to a cotton or tobacco plantation. Being a teacher and not much of a landowner, he often rented out their labor to others in Lexington and to the Military Institute. Furthermore, while he was not a staunch voice against the abolition movement, there is also no record of any kind of him voicing opposition to the institution of slavery. That said, while teaching in Lexington, he included African American children in the Sunday school classes that he taught at the Presbyterian Church, staring down a lot of opposition in doing so from members of the congregation who were opposed to such a move. In short, he epitomized the more moderate Southern Confederate. Jackson was involved in one of the most important episodes in the abolition agitation which characterized the 1850s and which was one of the major precursors to the outbreak of the American Civil War. On the 16th of October 1859, the firebrand abolitionist campaigner John Brown had taken over the U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, along with nearly 24 followers. His plan was to incite a slave revolt across the southern states through his example. Instead, his small band was quickly surrounded and Harper's Ferry was laid siege to. It ended 2 days later with half of Brown's men killed and the rest arrested. Brown was quickly sentenced to be executed. Jackson received word at the Military Institute that he and some of his senior students were to be sent as artillery officers to attend the execution at Charlestown, in what is now West Virginia, on the 2nd of December 1859. Stonewall Jackson would acquire his famous name and forge his legacy in the American Civil War. Strangely, for such a pivotal conflict in American history, and one which seems to have ostensibly been fought over one issue, historians still debate why the war broke out. Clearly, the issue of slavery and the determination of the northern states to abolish the practice nationwide was the defining cause of the war, but there were some other issues as well, with many who would take up the Confederate cause arguing then and afterwards that it was also about a different, urbanized, industrializing society in the northern states trying to impose its way of life on the American South and failing to respect its traditions. There may be at least some kernel of truth to this, for Jackson was not ideologically wedded to the preservation of slavery, yet nevertheless became a committed Confederate for a range of other reasons. Tensions nationally reached a crisis during the U.S. presidential election of 1860, when the concerns of the Southern states were whipped up over the potential election of the new Republican Party's candidate, Abraham Lincoln. What's often overlooked is that while Lincoln was clearly anti-slavery, he did not run on an abolitionist platform in 1860. However, enough people believed he intended to abolish slavery all the same that, when he won the election following the vote on the 6th of November in what was a deeply divided field of candidates, talk intensified in the Southern states about seceding from the federal union to avoid having abolition imposed by Lincoln's administration when he took office. South Carolina seceded on the 20th of December 1860, followed by numerous other states westwards to Louisiana and Texas in the first months of 1861. These formed themselves into the Confederate States of America in early February, the capital of which was soon fixed in Richmond, Virginia, bizarrely located less than 100 miles from Washington, D.C. When the Confederates attacked federal troops fighting for what became known as the Union government in the conflict that was now developing at Fort Sumter in South Carolina on the 12th of April 1861, it signaled the commencement of the American Civil War. The war would pitch a confederacy consisting of Virginia, Georgia, the Carolinas, Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas against the northern states from New England, New York, and Pennsylvania all the way westwards to the Great Lakes. The newly emergent states of California, Oregon, and Nevada also joined the Union cause. Several states, such as West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, effectively became border states that were on the front line of the conflict between North and South, and which were pulled to and fro by both camps over the next several years. It may seem curious for a man who would become a legendary figure within the Confederate cause, but Jackson was not in favor of secession in the period leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War. He, like many others, wanted to preserve the Union. It was only later, when he perceived the choice as being between the maintenance of Southern society and the preservation of the Union, that he became an advocate of secession, his conversion coming about late in 1860 and early 1861, even as states were beginning to secede. As such, he was one of many people who were cast into a tunnel vision by the 1860 election that doomed them to thinking that only war could resolve the nation's difficulties. His decision to eventually support the Confederate cause was a difficult one for Thomas on a personal level. His sister, Laura, with whom he had a close bond since childhood, supported the Union and was particularly ardent in this, her backing for Lincoln's administration in Washington being more fervent than Thomas's for the Richmond government. Even before the war broke out, this had caused a split between the pair that would never be healed. Years later, when she learned of his death, she feigned a lack of concern, but privately seemed to be disturbed by the news. It was all a sign of how divisive the American Civil War was in pitting family members against each other, and how complicated the emotions that ensued could be. Despite becoming the center of the Confederate government in the American Civil War, Virginia was actually quite late to secede. The Virginia Convention initially voted to remain a part of the Union when they voted on the issue in early 1861. It was not until a meeting on the 17th of April 1861, 5 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, that Virginia voted to secede and left the Union. This began Jackson's Civil War, as he was a Virginia native and employed there. As the state government swiftly mobilized onto a war footing, he was appointed as a major of the topographical engineers within the Confederate Army here, a role which would involve overseeing establishing defensive fortifications and also working with the officer corps of the Confederate Army on issues like mapping out the war zones across Virginia and the distribution of forces in the region. Frustrated at the sedentary nature of this, he petitioned for an active command and was soon made a colonel of the infantry at Harper's Ferry, the arsenal where John Brown had attempted to launch his revolt 2 years earlier. A further promotion to become a brigadier general in the Confederate Army soon followed. Jackson's first major engagement, and the one in which he would earn his famous nickname, was the First Battle of Bull Run, fought on the 21st of July, 1861, and so named after a stream that runs through the region where the battle took place. The clash is also known as the Battle of Manassas. It occurred near the city of Manassas in northeastern Virginia, not far at all from Washington, D.C., emphasizing the threat the Confederates posed to Lincoln's government in the first half of the war. Though they had larger forces in the wider region at the time, both the Union and Confederate commanders were only able to commit slightly less than 20,000 men each to the battle when it commenced. In the engagement, Jackson's brigade of men stood strong for hours under heavy fire from Union forces, with Thomas nearly being killed as a bullet grazed his hand and broke his middle finger. The battle ended in a Confederate victory of a kind, though both sides suffered significant losses, and it made clear that there would be no swift victory for either side in the war. Jackson earned his nickname Stonewall from the engagement, with one of the Confederate commanders, General Barnard B., stating at one point during the fighting, "Look, men, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall," in an attempt to buck his men up by looking to Jackson for inspiration. It was a name that would be attached to him for the rest of his life, and the forces under his command would become known as Stonewall's Brigade. That said, to his men, he was often known as Old Jack, a nickname he had acquired years earlier when studying at West Point in the mid-1840s on account of his being the oldest cadet in his class. Jackson was now promoted to the post of Major General in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States. He would soon earn further renown owing to his leading role in the Shenandoah Campaign, often also termed the Jackson's Valley Campaign. The Shenandoah Valley is a valley in the northwest of the state of Virginia. It had a strategic significance within the war, as it allowed for passage between Virginia north to states like Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, in a part of the country where natural routeways for armies to pass through are limited, owing to the Blue Ridge Mountains and several rivers. Equally, if any large Union army wanted to pass southwards to strike at places like Western Virginia, North Carolina, or Tennessee, the Shenandoah Valley was an obvious passageway. An indication of this is that when Robert E. Lee invaded the northern states in 1863 in the lead-up to the Battle of Gettysburg, he led his men northwards to Pennsylvania through the Shenandoah Valley. In the spring of 1862, Jackson was sent to secure this region and prevent any Union incursions southwards. This was coming at a time when Confederate fortunes in the early stages of the war were at a low ebb after a series of defeats in the second half of 1861, especially further west, where the Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant had won several important victories in the autumn and winter of 1861. The immediate concern for Jackson when he led some 15,000 men westwards into the Shenandoah Valley in the early spring of 1862 was to block the advance of Union forces through the valley who might manage to then reinforce the Union army of General George B. McClellan, Jackson's old classmate from West Point. If he was reinforced, it was possible that McClellan would be able to threaten Richmond and potentially capture the Confederate capital. Over the course of a 4-month campaign between March and June 1862, Stonewall managed to win a chain of successive victories over the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. The first victory of a kind came at the Battle of Kernstown on the 23rd of March. It was somewhat ambiguous. Theoretically, Jackson lost more men than Nathan Kimball's Union forces, but he pressured the Union to divert forces which were heading to reinforce McClellan away from their destination and into the Shenandoah Valley to deal with the threat which Stonewall's brigade now posed there. Thereafter, he continued to harry the Union forces in the valley, culminating in 2 victories on 2 successive days at Cross Keys and Port Republic on the 8th and 9th of June 1862. None of these involved catastrophic defeats for the Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. Instead, it was a series of attritional victories for Jackson, ones in which he inflicted a few hundred more casualties on his opponents on several occasions, and which collectively made it nigh on impossible for the Union to use the Shenandoah Valley to reinforce McClellan. Owing to this, the effort to try and strike at Richmond had to be constantly postponed in 1862, while, in the Union capital, Lincoln's government was wary of the possibility that, if he was reinforced himself, Jackson could make a swift surprise attack on Washington, D.C. Union forces and had to be kept on a defensive posture in the capital as a result, tying up divisions which otherwise could have been employed against the Confederates elsewhere to the south. The Shenandoah Valley campaign earned Jackson a lot of respect from his contemporaries, both amongst Confederate and Union military commanders. It occurred during a period when Confederate fortunes were not good and a strategic victory of some kind was much needed. He had achieved his successes through traits which came to characterize his entire leadership style. For Jackson, speed was critical. If he was able to prevent the Union from utilizing the Shenandoah Valley, then he needed to be able to move quickly around and respond to developments when and as they occurred. This was no mean task, commanding what was primarily an infantry army. In order to achieve it, he would demand punishing marches of his men where they moved so swiftly that they began referring to themselves as Jackson's foot cavalry, the suggestion being they could move as fast as cavalry divisions. This ensured that even though he was always substantially outnumbered in the Shenandoah Valley, having about 17,000 men at maximum strength against combined Union detachments of 30,000 or more, he was able to win numerous tactical victories, often striking at isolated sections of the Union army and never engaging their full forces. It has been estimated that Jackson and his men marched over 600 miles in different directions around Western Virginia in the space of 7 weeks between late April and early June 1862, averaging about 12 miles per day. No easy feat for men carrying military equipment in a warm Virginia May and June. Unsurprisingly, many of Jackson's rank-and-file soldiers initially disliked his methods, though as they achieved a growing number of victories, they could see the wisdom in their rather unorthodox commander's approach. As much as Jackson's reputation was burnished by the Shenandoah Valley campaign, it was not without controversy. One of his junior officers was Brigadier General Richard B. Garnett. Garnett was in charge of one of the divisions of Stonewall's brigade at the Battle of Kernstown early in the campaign, during the course of which he ordered a retreat of his units without receiving authorization from Jackson. After the battle, Jackson accused Garnett of cowardice and began the process of having him court-martialed. In the midst of war, the Confederate Staff Command was not particularly interested in trying to resolve a dispute between two officers in a situation where the facts of what had occurred were open to debate. Nevertheless, Jackson continued to press the case, and Garnett remained under investigation into 1863. He was still living under a cloud when the Battle of Gettysburg occurred in that year. Garnett died in the course of this, with many interpreting a reckless charge which he led during the engagement as an attempt to recover his reputation and honor in light of Jackson's charges. It was a symptom of one of the less pleasant aspects of Jackson's character and role as a commander. He could be extremely demanding and obstinate in his demands, often requiring more of his men than many deemed to be practically possible. This, along with his generally guarded character, could rub people the wrong way, and he often clashed with other military officers. On top of this, some of those who worked with him, particularly junior officers like Garnett, found his methods peculiar at times. Jackson had a habit of not revealing what his overall strategy was in campaigns like the one in the Shenandoah Valley, only drip-feeding information to his sub-officers at the last minute. Many of these officers felt this was excessive and prevented them from carrying out their orders or responding to events on the field of battle without knowing what the overall operational strategy was. As the Shenandoah Valley campaign came to an end in the summer of 1862, Robert E. Lee called Jackson back eastwards towards Richmond. He had been mired in a clash known as the Peninsula Campaign here for several months, so named after the Virginia Peninsula, a strip of land where Jamestown, the first permanent European settlement in the United States, had been founded 2.5 centuries earlier, and which Richmond stood at the very upper end of. By late May, McClellan was determined to lay siege to Richmond even without the major reinforcement he had been looking for through the Shenandoah Valley. Owing to Jackson having limited this reinforcement through his maneuvers to the west, Lee managed to repel McClellan's advance on the Confederate capital. Then, in late June, having been reinforced himself by Jackson, he went on the offensive in a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles between the 25th of June and the 1st of July, 1862. In these, Jackson and Stonewall's brigade participated in several engagements at Mechanicsville, Savage's Station, and Malvern Hill, amongst others. It was not his greatest performance, with some contemporaries and military historians since noting that his men moved slowly and that Jackson was tardy in implementing some commands. There were some good reasons for this, however. By midsummer 1862, his men were exhausted from months of heavy forced marches in the Shenandoah, and then a swift trek back eastwards to participate in different battles day after day. Jackson was also less familiar with the terrain here than he was back westwards where he had spent much of his life, and the maps he was provided with did little to help him in this regard. Observers noted he looked tired, and Jackson was certainly running on fumes by the time of the 7 Days battles. Despite his own personal limitations, Lee was successful in expelling McClellan's forces and bringing the Peninsula Campaign to an end. Much of this was owing to Jackson's efforts in the Shenandoah Valley over the previous months. Victory in the 7 Days' battles provided the Confederates with only a brief respite from another Union push into Virginia, although it was sufficient for Jackson and his men to get a week's rest, a few nights of proper sleep, and to put back on a few pounds after weeks of forced marches. Newly reinvigorated by late July, Lee offered Jackson a new command to head north and repulse an incursion by a Union force under the command of General John Pope. Pope was aiming to capture Gordonsville, 60 miles northwest of Richmond. He didn't immediately end up engaging with Pope and his larger army. Instead, Jackson received word that a Union force of some 12,000 men under Nathaniel P. Banks was in a position at Cedar Mountain, south of the town of Culpeper, about 30 miles north of Gordonsville. He moved to intercept them and cut them off from Pope's larger force with about 22,000 men. Heavily outnumbering Banks's army, Jackson was able to win a substantial victory at the Battle of Cedar Mountain on the 9th of August 1862, again employing his trademark swift movement across the Virginia countryside to good effect. Within weeks, Jackson was involved in another major engagement. This was the Second Battle of Bull Run, fought in the final days of August 1862. His role in the second major clash near Manassas, in the space of just over a year, emphasizes the sheer endless nature of Jackson's wartime effort. He went to war in April 1861 and was almost constantly campaigning over the next 2 years. In one of the largest battles yet of the Civil War, he was deputized next to Lee. Jackson's troops were responsible for maneuvering around the Union army of General John Pope and capturing their supply depot at Manassas Junction. This occurred on the 27th of August. Pope then moved with his larger forces to strike at Jackson's divisions on the 28th. Jackson and his men lived up to their Stonewall reputation by standing firm against Pope's attacks for long enough that Lee then moved into the Manassas area and struck Pope's left flanks on the 30th of August, inflicting serious casualties on the Union army and driving them out of the Manassas region. This was a major victory for the Confederates, one which now allowed them to consider launching a counter-campaign into Maryland after a solid year of fending off attacks from the Union armies in Virginia. Jackson was central to its success. Immediately after the Second Battle of Bull Run, Lee divided his forces. He headed north with the bulk of the Virginia army to strike into Maryland and threaten Washington, D.C., leaving Jackson with a reserve force in Virginia to try to consolidate Confederate control over regions that the Union armies had previously captured and to prevent any surprise strike towards Richmond. On the 15th of September, with the Union now preparing to defend Maryland, Jackson was able to take advantage of the situation to capture Harper's Ferry, taking a significant number of POWs in the garrison in the process. Having done so, he then immediately began a swift march towards Lee's position in Maryland. The Confederate commander had been blocked here by McClellan's forces at Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg as the Union general sought to prevent McClellan advancing any further north. Jackson's swift march there couldn't prevent a Union victory in the Battle of Antietam on the 17th of September, but his arrival did ensure that Lee did not suffer a major defeat as Jackson's men provided cover during a staged withdrawal. Not long afterwards, in recognition of exceptional service over the past year and a half, Lee promoted Jackson to the rank of Lieutenant General and assigned him as overall commander of the 2nd Corps, effectively now being junior only to Lee himself on the Virginia front in the war. Jackson would fight in one final major engagement in 1862. This was at the Battle of Fredericksburg in mid-December. Fredericksburg lies almost exactly midway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, and the battle here was possibly a fitting statement of how evenly matched the two sides in the Civil War were as 1862 drew to a close. It came about owing to one of the by now common efforts to launch a surprise attack at an enemy capital, in this case by a Union army led by Major General Ambrose Burnside. Jackson was appointed to command the right flank of the forces which were commanded overall by Lee. A curious element of the engagement was that Jackson left a gap in his lines which Burnside's forces attempted to exploit. Whether or not this was an intentional effort to lure the Union troops into some sort of trap, or simply a mistake by Jackson, remains unclear. The battle eventually ended on the 15th of December in a Confederate victory. With the Union repulsed, both sides withdrew to winter camps, and there was a lack of activity into the early spring of 1863. This period of unusual rest for Jackson was complicated by several of his junior officers requesting transfers to other divisions where they would not be under Jackson's command. Resentments were brewing amongst officers about his unwillingness to consult with them about tactical plans, with Jackson treating his underlings like automatons who should simply obey his orders unquestioningly. One of the dissenters was even his brother-in-law, D.H. Hill, who was married to Isabella Morrison, the sister of Jackson's wife, Anna. By the late spring of 1863, the Confederate lines in Virginia were increasingly stretched and short of men to plug the gaps. The Union commander, Joseph Hooker, decided to take advantage of this by outflanking Lee's position and trying to push south towards Richmond. As with so much else about the war in Virginia and the border states, the strategic imperative was to threaten the enemy's capital so as to force them to divert armies from elsewhere. This resulted in late April in the Battle of Chancellorsville, fought over the space of a week down to the 6th of May. Jackson and Stonewall's brigade played an absolutely crucial role in this. The early stages of the battle were fought between Lee's armies and those of Hooker, but on the 2nd of May, Jackson executed a brilliant counter-flanking maneuver in which his signature swift march surprised Hooker's troops with an attack on the right of their positions around Chancellorsville. In order to achieve this, they had to pass through a 7-mile stretch of Virginia known as the Wilderness. Such was its inhospitable nature. Hooker simply did not expect that Jackson could pass through it, and his men were so unprepared when Stonewall's brigade arrived out of nowhere that their flank buckled. This turned the tide in the wider Battle of Chancellorsville, allowing Lee to emerge with a major victory overall a few days later, the Union forces having suffered over 4,000 more casualties than the Confederates. Jackson's victory came at a terrible personal price. When his men emerged from the Wilderness to strike at Hooker's flank on the 2nd of May, they did so out of order and were not lined up properly. As night descended that evening, matters became quite confused, and Jackson was hit in multiple places in his right hand and his left arm by friendly fire. The wound to the upper humerus of his left arm was deep, and in an age before antibiotics to prevent such injuries becoming gangrenous, the only solution was amputation. Had Jackson's injury occurred just a few decades earlier, there would have been very little pain relief on offer during this procedure, other than what might be achieved through opium and alcohol. Somewhat luckily for the 60,000 men who had legs or arms amputated during the American Civil War, chloroform had been developed as a form of anesthesia in the 1830s and 1840s, and its use as a field anesthesia had been popularized during the Crimean War. Jackson was carried in the dark from the battlefield to a field hospital, a very long journey of several miles in which he was dropped twice from his stretcher. When he arrived there, chloroform was administered, and then the procedure was carried out on his left arm in an operation lasting 50 minutes. It was a sign of how effective chloroform was for this that within a few hours he was lucid and talking with people in the field hospital despite his injuries. Amputation was not simply about surviving the surgery during the Civil War. The shock of the operation and the risks of gangrene setting in anyway were such that many men died in the week or two afterwards. Jackson was one of the unlucky ones. In the days that followed, he developed pneumonia as his body reacted to his injuries, despite his doctors initially being confident of a full recovery. Learning of the news in the aftermath of the victory at Chancellorsville, Lee directed a messenger to head to the field hospital and tell Jackson that he has lost his left arm, but I my right, in reference to his reliance on Jackson as a field commander in Virginia. It's debatable if Jackson ever received the message, or, if he did, if he was lucid enough to understand it. After several days of his condition worsening, he died on the 10th of May 1863, 8 days after being shot. He was just 39 years of age. His funeral was performed and he was buried at Lexington, where he had taught and lived for many years, on the 15th of May. Jackson Crow laws quickly began to create a new form of major discrimination across the South through other means. In the post-war period, Jackson's legacy was lionized by defenders of the Confederacy and its cause, and he soon became a Southern folk hero of sorts, second only to Lee in the canon of Confederate war heroes. Many even speculated that if Jackson had survived and been at Gettysburg, the most significant battle of the entire war might have ended differently. His reputation was further burnished by his widow, who published 2 memoirs addressing elements of her life with her husband, books which included the text of many of his letters. In October 1919, a large equestrian statue of Jackson on a high pedestal was unveiled on Monument Avenue in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, where it joined statues of other Confederate generals and leaders like Lee and Jefferson Davis. Over time, he developed a dual legacy, one in which he was both a Confederate hero and also a figure who appealed to others who were less enamored of the Southern cause, viewing him as a romantic moderate, someone who was not a hard-line supporter of slavery, but with his Christian piety was genuinely a champion of the more rustic, conservative, tradition-bound life of the South. Hence, many American generals and commanders of the 20th century, such as George Patton and Douglas MacArthur, expressed admiration for Stonewall, while numerous writers like Alan Tate and Ernest Hemingway referred to him in their work. Like all Confederate political figures and commanders, Jackson's statue and monument in Richmond became a source of major controversy in the early 21st century, and the statue was removed in the summer of 2020 after being vandalized weeks earlier during Black Lives Matter protests. Another statue of Jackson at the Virginia Military Institute, where he taught throughout the 1850s, was moved to Newmarket Battlefield State Historical Park, where it was felt the statue could be displayed in a balanced way as a historical